Hello everyone, and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall Stout. The Oklahoma Wheat Commission says this year's harvest is pretty much in the books. We begin today with SUNUP's Curtis Hare talking with our Extension small grain specialist, Dr. Amanda Silva, to see how harvest went and how producers who are dealing with rain are doing with the wheat that they have left to cut.
We're almost across the finish line for the 2021 wheat harvest. Amanda, how has harvest been just in general?
So it has been a little bit of a stop and go. We started 7 to 10 days later than usual, and the high humidity held us a little bit. So at the beginning, especially southwest Oklahoma, we were only able to start cutting the wheat late afternoons because of the high humidity. But overall, yields have been favorable, test weight have been favorable for those fields that were harvested in a good time.
So, and a lot of producers had wheat harvested, but just like a few weeks ago, there was a lot of heavy rains through a lot of part of the state. Did that have any impact at all for the producers who were still cutting?
Yes, it had a little bit. So like I said, test weights were about above 60 pounds per bushel, 64 in some places. And with this recent rainfalls, we are seeing some impact on the wheat crop. So we are seeing that reduction in test weight, but hopefully that will not affect the overall state average.
So in regards to, we've been hearing some reports of producers who are out in the fields and some sprouting issues. Can you talk a little bit about that at all?
Yes, and that is due to all these rains in the past week and people not being able to harvest on time. So sprout damaged wheat can be a problem as far as storage, can be a problem on the flour. So you may see a reduction in falling number, which affects the bread making process. For people considering planting wheat as a seed wheat with sprout damage, they need to consider that the level of sprout damage on the crop. So if they're seeing already the root, the coleoptile emerged from the seed, so that is not a good option for planting as a wheat seed. However, so what I mean is, it depends on the level of sprout damage. People could use that wheat as a seed wheat or not. But if the seeds are just swollen or you see the seed coat split a little bit, that could be used as a seed wheat. Another thing to consider is that a sprout damaged seed may have a lower vigor, and so it's a good idea to run some germination tests right now after harvesting and also before planting to take into consideration to see if they need to make adjustments or not as far as a seeding rate.
Were you surprised at all that it actually turned out to be a fairly decent harvest in regards to quality?
Yes, we had a very cool month of May, and that helped a lot during the grain filling, and that is reflecting now the very good test weights that we had in our crop for the crops that were harvested in a good time. The results are posted on our website for the variety trial, so all locations are harvested by now. You can clearly see the effect of this delayed harvest on test weight in some of the locations, especially in our locations that were harvested last week at Kildare and Keys. People can also see a fungicide response and how that really paid off this year, applying fungicide, especially for very susceptible varieties to stripe rust and leaf rust. And one thing that I really like to emphasize for producers is to look at the results of the variety trials in a location that is nearby theirs, but not only this year's results, but also looking at that 2-year and 3-year average that provides a very good perspective on the variety performance in their field on a long run.
All right, thanks Amanda. Dr. Amanda Silva, Extension Small Grain Specialist here at Oklahoma State University. And if you'd like a link to the wheat variety trial results that she mentioned, go to our website, SUNUP.okstate.edu.
Good morning everyone. Wesley is out this week, so I'm flying solo. We're going to start out by talking about drought, a little bit about rainfall, and then we're going to check and see if we're ever going to have a real summer this July. Let's get started. When we start out looking at this week's U.S. Drought Monitor, we do see that We still have just a tiny bit of moderate drought out across western Oklahoma, but we do have larger areas of abnormally dry conditions that are threatening to go to drought if we don't receive some good rainfall in the next few weeks. I thought this would be a good time to look at the overall picture as we take a look at the U.S. depiction from the Drought Monitor. We do see much of the southwestern U.S. covered by exceptional drought. That's the worst category. But we also see the really bad drought up into the northern plains. Now, for those wheat growing areas up in that region, that's pretty bad news. And it's really been just since the start of May that we've had these big changes. We'll get back a little bit into April. But if we look at this category change map from the U.S. Drought Monitor, the greens are improvements in the drought categories, and the yellows and oranges and browns, those are the degrading areas of drought, so where it's getting worse. We see down and across Texas and southern and western Oklahoma, lots of green, also out in the eastern plains of Colorado, over into western Kansas. But things have just gotten worse out across California, up into the Pacific Northwest, a little bit over into the western high plains of Montana. So a little bit of a different fate over the last 3 months of different parts of the country. So obviously it's been cooler than normal, really through much of the spring and into the middle of summer. We've been cool all the way through mid-July. What's it going to look like for next week? Well, we see from the Climate Prediction Center, we have increased odds, in fact, greatly increased odds of below normal temperatures across the entire state of Oklahoma, but especially for that southern region of the state. So that's probably a good indication of some rainfall down in that region. And if we do take a look at the precipitation outlook for next week, we see those increased odds of above normal precipitation really centered down around South Texas, but that does come up into the southern half of Oklahoma. Drier up there in the northern parts of the United States where that drought is just starting to strengthen and get a lot worse. So not good news for those folks. So vastly different conditions across much of the U.S. with western and northern parts of the U.S. Really bad drought going on, lots of heat. Down here in the southern plains and the southern U.S., not much drought. And for our region, really not much of the summer, at least with any heat yet. So it's something we're going to have to watch. August can get really hot, but if things continue this way, we might just skip right ahead to fall. That's it for this time. We'll see you next time on the Mesonet Weather Report.
Good morning, Oklahoma. Welcome back to Cow-Calf Corner. This week we're going to be talking to Dr. David Lalman about creep feeding. And Dave, to begin, what is creep feeding?
It can be a range of things, but I would define it as just providing supplemental nutrients to a calf that's still nursing its mother.
What are our pros and cons, Dave?
Most people are going to we could be talking about in terms of creep feeding, you could creep graze, and so, if you got a high quality forage, create a creep gate where those calves can go out and consume the higher quality forage, where the cows maybe have restricted access to that. But most people are going to be talking about some sort of a concentrate feed supplement. Probably the big con, especially now, is the cost. Probably the best way for people to calculate their cost of gain in a creep feeding program is through feed conversion. You need to have a good idea of how much feed it takes to get an extra pound of calf weight gain, whether you're talking about a seed stock operation or a commercial operation. And so just to give you an idea of how to do that and what that range would be, it can be anywhere from 5 pounds of feed to get an extra pound of gain, and there's published data with 15 pounds of feed to get an extra pound of weight gain. So a wide range. The better quality forage you have, the poorer the feed conversion is going to be. So that would be a negative in a case like this. A drawback to creep feeding program is going to cost more per pound of extra weight gain because you're just replacing forage.
What should we expect as far as intake on a 300-pound calf?
So if it's just ad lib creep feed, meaning you're just putting it in a self-feeder and letting them have at it, and there's no salt or an additive like rumensin to restrict or limit their feed intake. Ad lib, you know, calves are going to start out, you know, the first couple of weeks they're not going to eat much, or some will start really quick, and then a few of the more timid calves may learn to gradually consume feed, you know, maybe a week to 10 days behind those more aggressive calves. 2 or 3 pounds early, up to about a month on a 300 calf that's rapidly approaching 400 pounds. They're going to get up to 4 to 5 pounds within 2 months, even 90 days. And on an ad lib program and getting close to 500 pounds by that time, they're going to be up to around 6, 7 pounds. We've seen calves consume up to 8 pounds a day.
We know obviously there's a lot of products on the market, but if somebody had a custom feed mill that could make a ration for them, ballpark us on some crude protein and maybe energy parameters you'd suggest in a creep feed.
So most of the commercial creeps are going to be 14. You might find a few 12s, but really a 14% creep feed is a 16% creep feed on a dry matter basis. And that fits pretty well. A 3, 4, 500 pound calf that needs to gain 2.5 or 3 pounds a day, a 16% diet is pretty close to their protein requirements if they're gaining 3 pounds a day. Now that assumes you're not getting a whole lot from the forage. They are still getting something from mother's milk. But generally, by the time their feed intake goes up, people don't, you know, folks don't start creep feeding until, let's say, mid-lactation or somewhere in that neighborhood. By the time those calves are getting that big, 400 pounds plus, they're into late lactation. And so mother's really not producing all that much milk. She might be down below 10 pounds of milk a day, and whereas she might have started out at 25 or 30.
Interesting stuff. And Dave, we appreciate you joining us this week.
Absolutely. You bet. Thank you.
Appreciate you all joining us, and we'll see you next week on Cow-Calf Corner on SUNUP.
Now to our Ag Policy Specialist, Dr. Amy Hagerman, with some updates to the Conservation Reserve Program.
There are a couple of different ways you can engage in the CRP program. First is the continuous program, CRP enrollment that's available at any time during the year. There's also a general enrollment that happens, and that's targeting specific kinds of acres. That enrollment period ends July 23rd for those who are interested. Now, CRP General and CRP Continuous are both full set-aside programs. There are quite severe restrictions on grazing for those particular acres. There's also the CRP Grassland program. That has a little more flexibility with respect to how you use the land for grazing, and in return, it's a little lower rental rate. Here in Oklahoma, the CRP Grassland program might compete with our regular pasture rental. So if you're an owner of land and you're not sure which direction to go, either to put it in something like a CRP grassland or just to rent it out to your neighbors for grazing, you might look at the comparison of the rental rates for those two things. According to a recent study, the average pasture rental rate here in Oklahoma is a little over $15 per acre. A big change in CRP grassland this year is that there's a minimum rental rate of $15 per acre for the CRP grassland program. In addition, western Kansas, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and parts of the Texas Panhandle are also in a priority zone, meaning potentially an added $5 per acre on that rental rate for the contracts. This makes CRP grassland a really viable consideration for landowners who are considering what to do with their grassland in 2021. The CRP Grassland program opens July 12th and goes all the way out through August, the end of August, for sign up. If you might be interested in that program, producers need to contact their local Farm Service Agency office since they administer the program. They'll put in an application, basically offering their acres for the CRP program, and all those different applications will be ranked based on factors specifically associated with that land. Then they'll get back a contract that includes the conservation practices that would be expected for CRP acres, and they'll be able to make that decision of whether or not to enroll in the program for the next year.
We're talking sorghum now with our precision nutrient specialist, Dr. Brian Arnall. And Brian, you have some studies out here right now looking at nitrogen management in some of your sorghum fields.
Yeah, so we're at Perkins Research Station. We have some fun studies here looking at a lot of different management in sorghum, but two really kind of come into play for today. This is a nitrogen timing study. It's actually our third year of doing this. And the question is, how late can you wait on sorghum? So you're standing in the check, which is really yellow. It's not ever going to receive any nitrogen. You can tell that it's behind. And I'm right next to the pre-plant, which got everything up front. And so we're actually delaying it out. And so we're at boot stage, heading out in some plots, and we're still applying nitrogen. So the take home, we're looking at how long can you wait? Can you be deficient? Can we get the crop in the ground, see how it's doing before we call the fertilizer truck and rig and say, okay, it's now time to pay the money and put the inputs in. The first 2 years of data showed pretty consistently that as long as we got the nitrogen on by boot, so where that boot is starting to swell in the crop and you're seeing that up, and it is able to be reined in, we're able to recover from even the most extreme nitrogen deficiency, and not just recover, but make more than we did in that check that was applied early season. This Perkins is the sandy soil, so that check hardly ever keeps up with the in-season applications. And so we see again this year, the check is looking good, but our in-season applications are looking just as good. So those that are anywhere to 30 to 40 days after planting, where the boot's coming you just before the boot and you get rained in, is good. So it might be too late for our early season sorghums to have that much of an impact, but I would take that into consideration with our double crops that are out there that were probably rushed to be applied and might be getting up without a whole lot of fertility on them.
You also have another study that's going on as well in this area, so talk a little bit about that.
So you know, not everybody has the capability to have a sprayer with drops, and you know, I get a lot of questions about, I've got my sorghum, I want to fertilize, but how do I do it, and what damage do I cause if I use urea or use UAN? And so we went out this year at a lot of locations all over the state and basically applied nitrogen when the sorghum was about knee to waist high in every way we could, including probably the ways that I'd not recommend. So we dribble banded urea down the rows where it's not on plants, and we broadcast it, make sure we had urea fall in the prills. Then we used liquid, and we used a lot of methods at widths with liquid. So we had methods where we could put drops down, so we actually had a drop that went between rows and put it right on the soil. We had that same applicator streamer nozzles where over the top, and so we got burn on some leaves. And we had streamer bars, which is another configuration. And we also just had a flat fan, which just put nitrogen everywhere. So when we put nitrogen on in the summer, it's going to create a burn. So each one of those nozzle configurations create a different level of burn. And so our question was, how much burn can we have, still get benefit from the nitrogen, and still get benefit and not lose that photosynthetic material we need? While I would never recommend the flat fan, I recommend putting, if you can, put drops down, and so you can get it in between the rows and on this double crop, or just those streamers so you concentrate it more. From early work that we see, we can take a fair amount of tissue damage. The nitrogen is valuable enough to take some burn on that leaf tissue.
With this kind of this summer that we've had, kind of a lot of rain, but then kind of some dry spells, what are some issues that you're might be seeing in regards to leaching?
Yeah, so seeing quite a bit of leaching. Right here where we're at, this Perkins location, is a sandy soil. And so that's, you know, I mentioned a little bit earlier that pre-plant doesn't do well here. That's because we have a deep sand. And so every year that we have very much rains in June or July, which we've had plenty at the end of June and July, we have leaching of our nitrogen, and we've also had leaching of our sulfur. We've had enough rainfall that pushes that sulfur down, maybe below the root zone, because the roots haven't really had to explore the soil that much because they've had good moisture. And so in some of these areas that I'm seeing some nitrogen deficiency and I'm seeing sulfur deficiency. Now, if we're at heading stage, we're really kind of behind the 8 ball and can't do too much. The corns at tasseling, there's been some work that shows nitrogen at tasseling has some beneficial aspects, but it's hard to get on. So maybe if you can fertigate on your nitrogen for your corn or your sorghum, that might be an opportunity.
Alrighty, thanks, Brian. Dr. Brian Arnall, Precision Nutrient Specialist here at Oklahoma State University.
We're joined now by Dr. Dave Lalman, our extension beef cattle specialist. Dave, you and the team are getting some calls about sprouted wheat. Tell us what this is and kind of why the conditions are right this year.
Occasionally when, we have high moisture conditions and high humidity, especially for an extended part of time or length of time around harvest, some of that wheat will start to sprout in heads. And of course that's going to have, generally speaking, any sprouted wheat's going to have discounted price at market. And so that's when we start getting some calls from people saying, hey, should I feed this to livestock or not? What are the options?
So as people kind of weigh the options, what kind of guidance do you have for them?
There's primarily three things to consider. Number one, it needs to be around 12% moisture or less. Because if there happens to be vomitoxin in it, that mold will continue to grow if it's too high in moisture after harvest. So that's important. The other thing is the vomitoxin, which is a type of mycotoxin itself. Is there signs of presence of that mycotoxin or not? Our diagnostic lab here in Oklahoma does not test for mycotoxins. They farm it out now to North Dakota Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory, and we can provide a link to that laboratory for folks that are interested. It's going to cost about $175 per sample, but that gets you a wide range in mycotoxin testing. It's a very thorough test, and they do a great job. The third thing that folks would want to consider would be the test weight of the wheat. Generally, if it's 50 pounds per bushel or above, it should be good quality feed for livestock. In fact, about as good quality as corn in terms of energy supply. If it's below 50, we say 45 to 50 pounds of test weight, it's probably going to be about 95% of the feeding value of corn from an energy standpoint. Below 45 and it goes lower, of course. So the test weight would be the third important consideration.
So say people have weighed all the options and have figured out the quality and they decide they want to feed it to their herd. What guidance do you have then on the best ways to do that?
Okay, so 30 to 50% of the ration in general is a good, safe amount to include in the formulation. And the second thing would be it needs to be processed. So coarsely ground or rolled would be what most mills would do, and that works really well to increase the digestibility. You don't want to grind it too fine because then the animals can sort the fines out, and that leads to other problems. So coarse processing.
And you also have a fact sheet that might be useful to reference?
The principles that we mentioned here today are all covered in the fact sheet, and so that's a good resource for folks that are interested in feeding sprouted wheat.
Okay, great. We will look for that. Thanks a lot, Dave. And for a link to the fact sheet and the diagnostic lab, go to SUNUP.okstate.edu.
The Oklahoma wheat harvest is just about finished up, and the USDA released their most recent WASDE report. Kim, how are things looking?
Well, they're looking relatively good. That was mostly good news in the report, a little bit of shady bad stuff. I like to look at ending stocks. That summarizes the supply and the demand conditions. Looking at wheat, the market expected ending stocks to be 783 million bushels. They came in at 665. I think that's positive price-wise, and you can compare that to the June WASDE at 770. Going down to corn, the U.S. ending stocks at 1.43 billion bushels. That's above last month's 1.36, but it's right at expectations, so no impact there. Looking at world corn, they expected 11.4 billion bushels. They got 11.5, so a little bit of bad news, but not much there. And of course, the June was 11.46 billion bushels. Soybeans, man, beans are just tight. They expected 146 million bushels in the United States. It came in at 155, but what's 9 million among friends there when it's that tight? And it came in exactly the same as it was in June. World situation also tight, with the USDA coming in at 3.47. That's above the 3.5 expectations.
So how is this going to impact short-term prices?
Well, we had a little price rally there, and as you expect, most everything was neutral to slightly positive. You had a 20-cent price increase in wheat with Oklahoma prices somewhere around $5.90. You had a 25-cent increase in corn forward contract prices with corn around $5.25. 25-cent increase in milo prices, and they're at $5.95. Soybeans, a 30-cent price increase, not much in beans at $12.85. And we got a penny and a half in cotton at 89.5 cents.
What about long-term impacts?
Well, I think it sets the stage for positive moves in prices. At this level, I think we've got some room for prices to go on up. So it sets a good, solid foundation for prices. Could we have lower prices? Yes, but I think this report stabilized prices for a while.
So what's got to happen to change these price trends?
Well, it's going to be weather. Weather determines what happens in price. We've got probably 50% of the world's wheat harvest complete, so that means we got another 50 come in. Germany's having problems with weather getting in that crop, but the European Union as a whole has got a record crop coming in. So I think weather is a big factor. You've also got that drought up in North Dakota and up into Canada with spring wheat, canola, and other commodities like that.
So what should producers be thinking about moving forward?
Right now, I think they need to get their computer and their pencil and calculator out, calculate budgets, know exactly what their cost of production is, and compare that to the prices and figure out where they're making the most money and how they can continue to make a profit in farming.
All right, thank you very much, Kim. Kim Anderson, Grain Marketing Specialist here at Oklahoma State University.
That'll do it for us this week. A reminder, you can see us anytime at SUNUP.okstate.edu and also follow us on YouTube and social media. I'm Lyndall Stout. Have a great week, everyone, and remember, Oklahoma agriculture starts at sunup.